Hello. So, welcome to the first of the summer colloquia. Today we've got Juie Shetye, who is visiting here for this week and most of next week, working with Phil, I think. So she studied in Mumbai and in UCL London before doing her PhD at the University of Queen's, Belfast. And she's now a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Warwick in England. And today she'll tell us about high-resolution observations of chromospheric waves.
Okay, thank you. So, thanks for the introduction, and thanks for welcoming me to HAO and giving for the colloquium talk. So, in order to start the talk, I want to just give a gist of what I'm working at CFSA. So, the main thing what I did during my PhD was observations of chromosphere. And the postdoc is basically understanding those observations and adding them to the theory and simulations that we have. So on the broader point of view, I look into the dynamics of chromospheric heating. But then on a smaller scale, I look at different individual events like LMR bombs, spicules, swirls, and fibrils, and try to understand their role in heating the solar atmosphere. So in order to do that, I do use a lot of ground-based instruments. So I go to telescopes where I can zoom into a larger field of view and study each individual structure and understand the physics. So what we do, the second aspect of the whole research is about simulations, and those are written by Tony Harper, who's in Warwick, and he would then use the observations as drivers for the simulations. The main talk and the projects that I deal with is swirls, spicules, and a bit of chromosphere. So in a brief idea, it gives you a picture of what's going to happen. And so I'm going to take you through some observations of various aspects of chromosphere. I'll begin my talk with just observations of chromosphere, what it looks like, then the technical aspect of how we observe them, what sort of observing strategies we use. Then I focus on two science cases, swirls and spicules. Spicules are towards the higher frequency range of the waves, so we need faster cadences and better, different observing strategy to observe these rapid evolving events. Then there are methods to analyze these high frequency waves, and I'll show you some examples of how we analyze them. In terms of swirls, they are slowly evolving structures and last a lot longer. They kind of are in the low frequency regime of waves that they drive. The question that we can try to put forward, what I try to put forward is to see the relation between swirls and spicules and to understand that's kind of the future aspect of interpreting this, that involves interpreting these observations and understanding the physics. So I begin with the chromosphere. This is an image of a solar eclipse. So you have the disk, and the chromosphere is this thin red region, the pinkish red region that you see. So you see it as a very thin layer. However, it is quite significant in terms of different dynamics that happen. This is a summary of series of lectures that Phil gave, and that was related to trying to understand the physics of chromosphere, trying to solve the puzzle, why it's important. So in summary, what we do have in the chromosphere is it's very inhomogeneous layer. There are many physical processes occurring at the same time. So you have collisions of ions, you have radiative physics, and you have other things. And the reason for that is because you go from a very low plasma beta regime to a very high plasma beta regime. So you have something like complicated two different dynamics. They try to between this packed into this chromospheric layer, where one side you have something that's very closely related to the photosphere, and the other side you have something that's very closely related to the chromosphere, and we're trying to understand what's happening. So you have all different mechanisms playing playing a part in different chromospheric dynamics. So in addition, what it is it's more like a natural thermostat. So you have, when a small energy that is generated is dissipated in seconds by different cooling procedures. And then you also have, to get that much energy, it needs a lot more power. So that's a kind of 100 times more power than the corona. So in order to give you an idea about a sketch of chromosphere where we look at different structures, what we have here is a cartoon that shows you the photosphere, and you see all the granulation that occurs in the photosphere. You go higher up from photosphere to chromosphere, and you see that the magnetic field lines are kind of expanding, and as they expand, you have plasma flowing along them, and you see different structures that are formed. Now, and this plasma that's formed between these field lines can then enter the corona in a simplest way. What we look at are this region of between photosphere and the chromosphere. So I look at events that are triggered by the photosphere here. So you have events that are triggered by the granular motion. So they kind of trigger the rotation that sets in shocks that move in from the photosphere higher up. And then you somehow get spicules and fibrils, which are dense chromospheric material forming higher up. So we're trying to interline, trying to put all these pieces of puzzle together to understand how different layers are connected. So moving on a bit more into the technical part of what we do. So you see on the top left image there, the K1 is the full disk image of the sun. The small square here shown by the arrow is the region that we zoom into using the telescopes that we use. So we are enlarging that field of view, which is roughly 40,000 kilometers, square kilometers, and look into what happens. The top panel is constructed from SDO images. So these are higher temperatures. Then you have these two panels, which are somewhere in the transition region side, and also from SDO. So at this region, SST observes, the first image it observes in calcium line, you see some granulation. The second image is H-alpha, where you see, again, some granulation. And the third image is from iron, where you see some kind of bright magnetic element. So you see it's similar to magnetogram. So you see the positive and the negative polarities that are there in that quiet sun region. So it kind of gives you an idea about what the telescopes can do. So the technique that we use is called imaging spectroscopy. So if you're just taking a spectrograph, you're scanning through different lines, wavelength positions. So here's an example where you have the spectrograph and you have a narrowband filter that scans along the spectral line. Now, here you see the images corresponding to these line positions. So as you scan through the line, that means you go from, say, red wing position here and the blue wing position there. You see different aspects of the particular region on the sun. So you sort of see the chromosphere there, which is dense matte material, and you see all the fibrils near the core of the line. And as you go to the wings, you see all the photosphere, you see the granulation, you see supergranular cells and the edges of that. So you kind of scan through different layers of solar atmosphere, and you also see different aspects. So you combine physical parameters that you observe from there with the spectral parameters that you observe on using the spectral lines. So you get an understanding of different dynamics related to a particular event. So you would use such observations, and then we have some sort of observing sequences that we decide. So in this particular talk, I'm covering roughly 4 data sets that cover around 4 hours of observations using Swedish Solar Telescope. The cadences of observations are different. At one, I have 4-second cadence, which it's catered to observing spicules and rapid motions related to spicules, and 8 seconds cadence, where I see a long-term evolution of structures like swirls. So usually when we do observations, we take 1 or 2 spectral lines. So if I want 4 seconds cadence, I would just go for 1 spectral line. So I take H alpha line code, which is roughly in the visible range around 6563 angstroms, and then I select my observing points, wavelength points along the line, and at those lines I would take rapid images. I'll do the same thing for calcium and for iron. So this is kind of the standard observing sequence that I would use. Now in terms of if I want to observe different layers of the sun, I want to see the photosphere and the chromosphere all together, then I would use combination of H alpha line scan with iron. So after every H alpha line scan that I do, I would have iron image taken, and then I'd go back and continue with the sequence. So what I get in the end is a sequence of images where I develop an image cube, which is XY, covers your spatial coordinates. Then you have the time for the temporal evolution, and then you have wavelength, which corresponds to the wavelength, different wavelengths that we take. So moving on to the more physical aspect of the talk, basically the first topic is related to spicules. And the question that we always want to answer is, what are spicules? So a simplest example is shown here. You see those thin, long, jet-like structures all over the solar chromosphere. And this is a crude definition of what a spicule is. So you'll have a flux tube, a very, very thin jet where the plasma moves up and down, and that's what you would call as a spicule. Now, there are thought to be 2 different types of spicules. They depend on different formation mechanisms, lifetimes, velocities of the plasma motion, and so on. So the reason why we study them is because they are thought to contribute towards the mass and energy cycle of the chromosphere and the corona, and to some extent the corona. So here's a sketch which shows you roughly where the 2 spicules lie. So that, for example, if you have the type 1 spicules, a bit longer lasting structures which seem to just lie between the photosphere and the chromosphere. So they are basically related to churning matter between these 2 lower layers of the solar atmosphere. And then you have type 2 spicules, which are longer open field lines where they can eject plasma along these field lines, and it can go higher up in the atmosphere, in some cases reach the corona. It gives you a rough idea why people want to study these events. So the peculiar events that we study are like spicules. That means they appear like spicule. They are long, thin structures, but they also are different from spicule, as in there is no sign of evolution. So if you had a spicule, you would see sign of plasma moving up and down. So there will be some evidence of evolution, but these events don't have any evidence of any evolution. So here's 2 images taken at aligned wing position, so more towards the photospheric side of H alpha line. And they're separated by 8 seconds. The arrows show you a peculiar structure that suddenly appears. You see something there, it's not clear, but it suddenly appears there. And this structure's appearance is irrespective of scene conditions suddenly improving or not. This whole structure is around 6,000 kilometers in length. So if you try to calculate that there is plasma suddenly flowing up and down, then that means it would have unphysical velocities. And these are the kind of events which still puzzle us. So the talk is not going to be about how they are formed, but about what happens when we observe them, what sort of waves are associated with them. But that's what we would get. We would have no idea about the evolution of these structures, but there's something happening. So this is an example of a specular type event that they call. So this, again, images are taken in the blue wing of H alpha line profile. So you see a lot of photospheric matter around, and then you see a suddenly appearing structure. So the structure suddenly appears and then disappears. So the whole length of the structure is appearing and disappearing within a few seconds. A cadence for that image is 4 seconds. So you have this structure appear in 4 seconds. And it also disappears in 4 seconds. So the other way to understand the sudden appearance was one that we did was to plot light curves. So if I go back here and you have the structure, along the length of the structure, we find light curves, we plot light curves. So you take the structure, at each pixel along the structure, you see how the intensity evolves. And then you see these dips. So I have taken one wavelength position, which I call as blue wing position. It's around 37 kilometers per second from Doppler shifted from the core. And you see that there is a sudden dip in its intensity. So the structures appear as absorption on the disk of the sun, and they appear as a sudden dip. And you see that in the red wing also. So you see that at the same location, you see dips along different wavelength positions as you scan. The right-hand side structure is a bit more complex, as in the sense it tends to show you that the structure suddenly appears, disappears by the time you reach here, then it appears again, and disappears and appears again. So it sort of shows you a repetitive appearance and disappearance, and that happens in both the wing positions. To see this repetitive behavior, I have a movie here which I'll play. So you see that there's multiple appearances and disappearances that happen along the length of the structure. So you have the whole 6,000 kilometer structure appearing, suddenly disappearing, appearing, and disappearing. Now, on the right-hand side panel, I have what we call as the time distance diagrams. Now, these are constructed, so you have, by taking the slit along the length of the structure. So you have the structure, you put a slit along its length, and you run the image cube in time. So you kind of get an impression of what happens at that slit. So if the structure suddenly appears, you see a straight line, as you see. So it suddenly appears and suddenly disappears at that slit. And this is what is shown by the right-hand side time distance plot. And the pink arrow gives you the time where it has suddenly appeared into a frame and disappeared. If this was a spicule, your time distance plot would be something like a V, so you'd see an evolution. Now, when they appear, they do these funny things, like they oscillate, they sway around, they kind of wobble. So this is an example where the structure suddenly appears, sways in our field of view, and disappears. So it's appearing, it's moving around in our field of view and disappearing. So it gives you an impression that there is some kind of wave phenomena related to these events. In order to study those, what we do is we plot, again, time distance diagrams, but instead of along the length, we put the slits perpendicular to the structure. So on the left-hand side, I have this event here, and I plot the slits perpendicular to the structure's length. Now, if the structure moves along the slits, you are going to see the evidence of that motion in what we call as the time distance diagram. So in the first case, at P1, you see that the structure kind of evolves. So you see something like a W traced by the structure as it moves along the slit. Now, these time distance diagrams can be plotted for different wavelength positions. So if the structure is present at different wavelength positions, I just put the same slits and I see its evolution. So you see slight evolution here, which is further away from the line code. But in the blue wing, there's just blobs, and this isn't much evidence of whether it's a wave or something. But that could be just because it's basically the dynamics in the blue wing and the red wing would be different. Plasma dynamics would be different, but also that the structure is only observed in narrowband field of view. So you see only its sudden appearances that occur along its length. So you just see the minima of a transverse wave that would pass through it. So you see, you do these kind of analysis. You also can understand if there is a standing wave or a propagating wave. So if I have this S, and if I have another such S at P10, and if the minimas coincide with each other, then that's what I would call as a standing wave. But if they move around, then I would call it as a propagating wave. And that's another thing that we tried to do in terms of understanding the dynamics. If I go back here, you see that the whole structure tends to move unanimously in one direction. So if I put slits along the structure, I'm probably going to get a standing wave moving around, which is comparing the time distance plots, it would probably be the same. Now, other sort of waves that we see are these rotating red and blue shifts along the structure. So the structure is in front of you and it's rotating. So you would see one part of the structure red shifted and the other part of the structure blue shifted. And these are done by, these are observed by looking into the Doppler images. So these images are constructed by subtracting intensities at equal distance from the line core. So you get just the evidence of something moving along. If the structure is stationary in both the wings, it's going to nullify, so you won't see anything. So what we did was, based on that analysis, what I did later on in 2018 was to do a statistical study of 2 data sets. Now, these data sets cover around 9 positions, 9 wavelength positions in H alpha, and it's both cover 2 different regions on the sun, but relatively quiet environment. And so in this 2 hours of observation, I found around 50 odd events. So I'll run first event, and you see the structure suddenly appearing, but you see some kind of a wobble that moves around the structure's length. So in the previous case, as the structure suddenly appeared, did a swaying motion and disappeared. Here you actually see something propagating along the length of the structure. And this is an example from the second data set, and you see similar behavior. So the structure suddenly appears, and you see a slight wobble along its length, and it disappears. So I would use the same time distance plots along the length of the structure to identify periods, oscillations, and frequencies, how much the structure has been displayed, and so on. we can't see the field of view size. So it's the field of view size is roughly 7,000 kilometers, square kilometers here. So the results from those 50-odd observations was that the first thing is the displacement, which is around 100 kilometers. So this displacement is from the mean position. So the structure is swaying, the displacement is along that. The transverse velocities are around 10 kilometers. But what's interesting is we do detect many structures in the high frequency regime. So the previous evidences are around 16 millihertz, and now we are looking at evidences of waves that are around that are higher than 25 millihertz. Basically, a lot of these events have frequencies around 62 millihertz. In a way, that's significant because if you had some structure, some wave related to spicule, you need high frequency to turn in the plasma higher up. So the next thing what I did was trying to understand the physical aspect of what I'm seeing, what I see. Also, I forgot to say that the high frequency comes from the fact that the natural chromospheric frequency is roughly 3 minutes. So something which lasts only 16 minutes, 16 seconds, or oscillates in 16 to 50 seconds would be called as high frequency, would give rise to a high frequency wave. Now, in terms of observing red and blue shifts, I come back to a case where you see the red and blue shifts in the profile. So in the second image, you see a structure which is completely red shifted. In 5 time steps further, which is here, you see the structure that has been it is now completely blue shifted. What you also see is the background changing from being blue shifted here to red shifted. So it's kind of showing you that the spicule is a part of a bigger structure. So it's a group of spicules or threads of a spicule that you see changing, having different Doppler signals. And this thing has been recently explained as to be caused by KHI instabilities. So here's a simulation done by Antolin. I will just go and explain the part that's kind of related to the observation. So this is a top-down view of the simulation. So it's a slit taken that way. And you see how the red and blue shifts, red and blue Doppler signs mix with each other. And you see a similar structuring here. So you see this threaded nature that I see with spicules in such simulations that can indicate that what we see in some cases related to this high frequency structures is nothing but KHI, so Kelvin-Helmholtz instability setting in at the edges of the spicule. So the next physical nature that I look into is in cases where there is more than one spicule. So here's a case where there are 3 spicules, and these 3 spicules tend to interact. They give you an impression that they are interacting rather than they actually physically interacting with each other. So here you have 3 cases. I put time distance plots from P1 to P10. P1 is where the structures are very close to each other, and at P10, along that slit, the structures are very far away from each other. Now, at these points, when I plot the time distance plots, then I show them at different positions here, P1, P5, P7, and P9. But what's interesting is the structures that are shown in blue. At P1, throughout the evolution, you see that the structures are close together. So you have this blue blob, rather, that shows that the structures are very closely packed towards each other. At P5, which is somewhere midway here, you see that the structures have separated, show separation, and they seem to interact. So you can roughly say, okay, maybe that's one structure going that way, the other one's tracing the S that way. The further up you go, so the further you go from along the slits, you see that the structures have moved away from each other or interacting at a wider separation. So this kind of behavior can be interpreted to give rise to various things related to mode coupling, and when you have such waves, then they could be coupled, there could be changes in physical nature of the structure. So, for example, imagine one of the flux tubes is moving towards the other inward. Okay? So if we trace the structure's motion, we can plot the velocity, and that's done by the red line here. So the red line tracks the velocity of the structure as it moves towards the other structure. What you see is when the velocity moves, we try to trace how the intensity varies, and that intensity variation is plotted by the black curve. And you see that when the structure moves in one direction, there is intensity increase. The structure moves away, there's a decrease in intensity. Then again, it goes into that direction, you see an increase in intensity. Now, ignoring the various complex dynamics of the chromosphere, what it does tell you is that, so you have spicule moving towards the other, it tends to compress the spicule, so you see the compression leads to an increase of intensity. It moves away, it shows you that the intensity has reduced. So that kind of motion is what you would say it's very closely related to this compressive waves, where you have the sausage-like motion. So you have a shape that compresses a flux tube and expands a flux tube. Now, this behavior is being seen to be present in a single flux tube scenario in the corona. So this could be similar to what we are looking at in the spicules. So these are different observational aspects that I see from spicules. So basically, what I summarize is what these observations tell us is, well, they tell us that the waves are propagating. So the next step is to understand what type of waves are propagating, whether these are alpha waves or these are just transverse oscillations or there's something else. Second, when I combine different observations from different layers, is to understand formation of this high frequency waves. And then to do the next few parts, I would need simulations to understand what's the physical significance and how they are related to heating. So if this high frequency wave dissipate, then what are the dissipation mechanisms, how that dissipation is converted into heating of the chromosphere is what I'm doing the next thing. So the next topic is about vortices in the solar chromosphere. And these vortices actually are very big, what they call as solar tornadoes. The first image is actually obtained in 1908, and it's done. It was obtained by Hale, and during his observations, he sees his foot points of prominences that kind of rotate. So that led to the idea that these are some kind of rotating structures. He calls them as swirls. In 2017, you had this image which shows you a large-scale tornado-like structure, and it's famous for being tornado on the sun. Then you have Swain showing you similar structures that occur in the photosphere. So you're looking at similar dynamics, but at much smaller scales. So scales here are in megameters. We would look into scales which is just few thousand kilometers away than 10 megameters or something that you see there. And so the observations of swirls, I mean, I'm showing you 5 cases going by column wise. The first column is H alpha images corresponding to the 5 cases. The second is calcium, calcium image taken in the red wing, so it's higher up in the chromosphere. The third one tells you the photospheric response, so what's happening on the photosphere. And the fourth one gives you the Doppler images, so it tells you whether the swirl's actually moving towards us or away from us. In chromospheric line, you see a very well-defined swirl. You see the rotation that happens. And this is a top-down view, so you're looking at the tornado happening like this. So you have the tornado moving along your field of view like that. So you're looking at something that's rotating in our field of view. Now, when you see the Doppler images, the red color shows you that the structure is moving away from us. That means the wings of the swirls are moving away from us. And the centers of the swirls are moving towards us. So it's kind of a motion that does something like that. So here's a movie before I started. So that's going to be showing you how the swirl develops in calcium line. This is going to be H alpha, where you see the edge of the swirl, which is which shows brightening. This is a photosphere. Observe the second magnetic element. These two magnetic elements interact, but the second one is related to the swirls that you see. And the third image is actually what is composite of all the other images. So it's just intensity added up. So when I see when I run the movie, you see a very well-defined swirl that kind of disentangles itself. You see it there in the chromosphere, so in calcium line. You see the same thing in the hydrogen line. You see the black part of the hydrogen line is actually the chromospheric matter, which is a bit higher up in the atmosphere. Now here you see how the magnetic bright points interact, and you see the second element actually goes through some kind of rotating phase. Now, I haven't zoomed into the movie to show you how it rotates, but and in third case, you see that the second magnetic bright point is actually where the center of the swirl lies. So it gives you an idea that this whole picture, it gives you the whole picture that the magnetic element kind of drives what happens in the chromosphere. Now, to understand what's happening, we are doing layer by layer analysis. So we try to trace the motion in the photosphere. So here you have a polar plot that actually shows you how the structure rotates. Now the polar plot goes from blue to yellow. It is showing two things. One, the direction of rotation. So the arrows are pointing towards how the structure is rotating. So it rotates from here, goes there, goes that. That's that kind of a structure. Two, the length of the arrows give you the velocity of the rotation. So it tells you that initially the rotating driver was faster, and then it became slow, and then became faster. So basically, it's showing you that the structure is doing like that, a kind of a motion. Now, the bottom picture is a power spectrum plot. It is constructed by comparing two directions of velocities vx and vy, and what it shows you that during the swirl, you have higher power in the photosphere, and there, once the swirl goes away, it has low power. So it sort of tells you that this low frequency motion is not anything random, but it's probably coherent motion, and it's pretty consistent with what's happening. So it's something that drives this motion. Now, at the chromosphere, we do a similar thing. So the first plot is just an XY plot, but the slits now, instead of being along straight Cartesian slits, they are polar slits. So you have a whole circle that tells you how the structure expands and rotates. I think you can see the slits. There are 3 slits, R1, 2, R3. The second image here shows you the intensity variation in the field of view. So average intensity variation is shown with the solid red line. The dashed line shows you intensity variations at a particular slit. The third plot shows you the radial motion, and unfortunately the line, the yellow line, actually shows you the direction and is used to calculate the radial velocity. So it's kind of overlines with the natures. So you would see a radial nature slit that would show you such behavior. So you go from one end here to the other end, like diagonally, and you can calculate radial velocity. Now, along these slits, you want to know how much the structure is expanded. So you take 2 slits, say R1 and R2, and do this kind of plots, which would give you then idea of the structure expanding. The structure seen in dark is darker. So you see here that there is some kind of expansion. And what's interesting is that the velocity there is, the expansion velocity is somewhere around, is positive, then it becomes negative. So it kind of tells you that maybe in the start, this expansion going away, and then it kind of compression. So the waves are coming towards us and then going away and coming towards us. So that kind of thing you can see from the plots. You can estimate from the plots there. The other thing, when you see a structure expanding in the chromosphere, you want to know if it interferes with plasma dynamics. So here what I do is I plot simple wavelets. So I have the field of view of the swirl, and I'm trying to plot the wavelet along this field of view. So I run my image cube before and after the swirl, and also during the swirl. So this region, the wavelets here I've taken are at 3 different positions along the line scan. So that's the first one is along the red wing of the calcium line. This one is at the blue wing of the calcium line, and that third one is at the core of the calcium line. The red circles show you what happens during the swirl. So if you can see before the swirl, now this is, the plots are also phase plots, so they will give you basically if the sine function here. So what you see here is that your periods are roughly around 180 seconds before and after the swirl in all the wavelength positions. So before the swirl, you have periods which are roughly 180 seconds. During the swirl, the periods tend to be modulated, and then they go back to the normal position. But what's interesting is just immediately before the swirl, before and after the swirl, you see frequency breaking up. So the way I interpret this behavior is that I interpret it by saying that the swirl interacts with the photosphere and somehow plays a role in changing the dynamics of the photosphere locally. So that was sort of my interpretation of what I see. So in all the 5 clear events that we see, we do see that they are interacting with there's some interaction with the plasma. What we also know, which is also been reported in the past, is that there is link between the photosphere and the chromosphere, and what happens is probably the trigger of the magnetic elements trigger the churning motion that happens, and that kind of pushes the plasma higher up. And the last thing which I point out is that the swirls can plasma around them. So if there were alpha waves or something, which is always what people call everything rotating on the chromosphere as alpha waves, then you won't see a kind of evidences, observational evidences that we see. So the reason why I showed you two different aspects is trying that there seemed to be some link between the swirling motions and the spicules. And if we had to see the swirls on disk, then you would see something which is very similar to what happens there. And you see something coming up, and then it kind of rotates. I'll let the movie run a few times. So you see, doesn't want to do it. So you see something that rotates. Now, you see this first rotation happened, and now you see the whole thing churning. So if you had to see the swirls at a different field of view, they would be similar to the spicules. It looks very similar to spicules. They would have this very well distinct, very well defined rotating driver. Now, theoretically, this thing was simulated by Ijima in 2017. So they use this rotational motion as a driver for a jet, and then they try to form spicules based on the rotation that they set in at the photosphere. I won't go into details of what happens here. Yeah. So in summary, what I've showed you is different aspects of chromospheric observations, both spicules and swirls. Now, they do give us a lot more, a better understanding of what's happening in terms of how big they are, what sort of velocities are related to these events, how the velocities are changing, how the structures are changing and evolving. However, to explain complete picture, what we try to do is we try to simulate what we see, which I've kind of highlighted in the past. But what's also necessary is to understand that even while looking at these observations, these are narrowband images, they don't give us complete plasma dynamics, and that kind of becomes science questions for next generation telescopes like DKIST and EST. And that's the conclusion. I'll leave you with another movie from Big Bear, Solar Observatory, which shows you completely different dynamics of what's happening on the sun. So you have the photosphere, you have the sunspot, and you see waves coming out of it. And there are also different types of propagating waves. So, thank you.
Any questions?
Seeing conditions that you had to get to achieve this were good, excellent.
Yeah, they are excellent. Yeah, in most cases there would be, well, I know how BBSO rates them. So in BBSO standard, it would be seeing condition 2 or 3. This one is BBSO condition 2, so I don't know. They have to be stable enough to observe some things.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by the fact that we had 20 years of observations of spicules starting with SETI, and then we had effectively Canode that showed with at least 10 times the angular resolution now, at least 1,000 times better seeing. And we see spicules on all scales.
Mm-hmm.
So it looks like the finer you look, that these things break up into narrower and narrower and narrower things. Is there any sign? Have you thought about whether there's an end to that process? process? Will we see spicules at the diffraction limit of decus, do you think, or will they really remain at 100 kilometers like you?
No, I think it will go to the diffraction limit of decus also. You'd see finer structures, because like like here, for example, this is a bit better than SSTC, and you see a lot more fine structuring. It's happened, and this is not even my final image. It's just one level of processing. So, when you obtain data set, you do level of post-processing things, and this is just final image after spectral reconstruction. So you already see these so many more, fragments towards what's happening. What this would just be looking like a sunsquake or something that just goes away, but then you do see material inside the sunquake. So I think that's going to continue.
The next question, when I look at that, what I see is, I think, it's just a personal impression I get looking at this thing, is that you have a fairly constant looking magnetic structure with different observability of plasma being made visible for us. And that what we're really looking at here is not changes in magnitude so much as just the thermal conditions.
Yes.
And so, but I wonder, when you're looking at your thing wobbling like this, whether those wobbles are due to thermal or the magnetic effects as a result of So, I think it would be very, very interesting to know. I mean, I would be amazed if the thermal structure were uniform. I'd be amazed if it isn't.
Yeah.
I'd be equally amazed if the magnetic structure in the vertical plasma was very, very highly structured. It can't be. There's too much stress and energy associated with that. But it would be nice to try and see if you can differentiate between a magnetic change and a thermal change. What we're looking at.
But you wouldn't expect that the magnetic field to change much because the energy density in the field is so much greater.
Yeah, the same is true in the spicules. The other way, it would be so correlated.
Yeah, and in terms of changes in plasma dynamics, then on theoretical aspect, we discussed this with Tony Arbor when we showed those wobbling things on spicules. And what he says is a simple explanation for that high frequency formation of these high frequency waves is you have a simple flux tube or a magnetic environment, and you eject plasma by some reason like reconnection or just shock, just drive it, and it would naturally shake the structure moving. So it's moving, and it's like the sonic booms that we see on Earth. You get the wobbles that propagates because there's just an ejection, sudden eruption that happens at one end of the structure, I think. So the thermal conditions would change naturally as a consequence.
Structures moving out.
Yeah.
And what's moving in is actually blood structures. Like if you look at the last bullet location,
yes.
O or the letter F, you actually see there.
Yeah. So
like it's almost like they go out, they go dark, they go back in.
Yeah. So the downflowing things, they are actually coronal rain. So it's a cooler structure. So if it's a cooler structure, you see it as an absorption. So you see a lot of structure falling back as an absorption. So you have the coronal rain falling down, and you have this instantaneously heated structures, like forms of waves that come away. So it's like emitting heat. Yeah.
Sorry, perhaps you mentioned this, but how fast of an observation cadence do you think you need to get the data?
So for the spicules, we have taken data which is the fastest is 0.7 seconds cadence. So it all depends on your observing strategy. So in my case, in the first observing experience that we had, we knew where the structures are located. So we selected our line positions related to that. So we could go on lower cadence. So we went to 4 seconds. But if you, okay, there's some other events that I can show you later on, but there you would see that in 4 seconds cadence, you see a big thick blob moving like that when you put the time distance plots. So if you had a higher cadence, so if it was 2 seconds cadence, your big thick blob would actually do that. So you have to zoom into the time distance plot. So there is an upper limit on how high, there isn't an upper limit on how high the waves you can observe, but you can, at present, I can observe 200 millihertz with the faster cadence things. But on the observational side of it, when you use the current setup, BBSO or SST, to observe such high cadence, you come into a physical limitation. So if your structure is like that, a thick structure, and you have a very thin slit that you observe that with, and the structure is moving, and you see rapid movements at very high cadence, but because you are limited physically by the size of the slit, you may not actually see what you expect. So in terms of that, there is a limit on how well we can resolve these very high frequency waves, but I don't know where the limit is.
Any more questions? Anyway, I think that must be the alarm that it's over then. Let's thank the speaker
Okay.
again.
Yes, thanks for that pointer.